Who was Preston Tucker? Was he an automotive innovator shot down by the big car makers, or was he a con man desperate to do anything to keep his automotive scheme afloat? Or was he simply a guy who loved cars and got in way over his head? Hi there, Rick DeBrule with another chapter in the automotive evolution, here once again at the Martin Auto Museum, a great collection of more than 170 cars that tell a lot of very interesting automotive stories, and perhaps few are more interesting than the story of this 1948 Tucker 48. Now, it was originally supposed to be called the Tucker Torpedo. They torpedoed that name after World War II, thinking, it's kind of a downer name when you think about it. Who wants to be torpedoed? So they dumped the torpedo name. Officially, it's just known as the Tucker 48. But before we talk too much about the car, really have to talk about the man, Tucker, Preston Tucker. I mean, the story of this man is very interesting in a lot of different ways, and he's somebody who absolutely loved cars and loved going fast. In fact, at one point, they say he joined the police department just so he had the opportunity to drive cars fast. He spent time at the Indianapolis Motor Speedway around the Indy 500. He got together with some of the people working at the Speedway, ultimately to help build cars. But more than anything else, Preston Tucker was a salesman. He knew how to sell cars, and he did it quite often during his career. And when he came up with the idea of building his own car, he knew if he was going to sell something to the public, it was going to have to be different. It was going to be creative. It was going to be spectacular. And that's pretty much what he came up with the Tucker 48, a car that was truly innovative on just about every level. But as the story goes, he was a major failure in many ways. Ultimately, there were only 51 of these cars built, one prototype, 50 production cars. Because his scheme, his plan to sell these cars to raise money, he didn't want to have conventional loans like most people would do if they were trying to build a company. No, he wanted to sell all kinds of things to dealers. He wanted to sell things in advance to the people who were going to be buying the cars, like accessories. At one point, the Securities and Exchange Commission stepped in and said, "Yeah, maybe you're breaking a lot of rules here." And just when he was about to become a major car maker, the SEC filed charges against him, and as a result, he faced a trial, by the way, where he was found not guilty. But a combination of all the problems that he faced trying to get these cars built, well, ultimately it sunk the company, and they never recovered from the bad publicity, from the trial, from the fact that they also had a lot of build problems with these cars. And while he had a lot of dreams about what the innovations were going to be, he was never quite able to pull off most of them. Having said that, is this an innovative car? Absolutely, in just about every way possible. This is completely different than what Detroit was building back in the 1940s. Now, you got to remember, they had just come out of World War II. The big three, back then there were actually more than three, but still the big three automakers, I mean, they were working hard to come out with their new designs in about 1948. That's when the era after World War II really began. Preston Tucker wanted his to come out even earlier, although he really wasn't successful in that regard. What he really wanted was something that was completely different, something that was going to say to the world that this car was worthy of you buying it instead of buying from a company that you knew a lot about. And once again, the innovations from front to back on this car are absolutely amazing. So let's walk around and take a look at the Tucker 48. I think this hood ornament just about says it all for the Tucker, boldly looking into the future. And that's exactly what the Tucker was supposed to do. If you could imagine Flash Gordon driving a car, this is exactly what the car would have looked like for Flash Gordon. It's almost aerodynamic, moving forward in that 1948 post-World War II style. This car was innovative on so many different levels, not just from a design perspective, but it was also supposed to be a much safer car. And a perfect example is something you can see at the front of the car. It has not two, but three headlights. They call this the Cyclops headlight. Now, it accomplished a couple things. Number one, it simply provided more light as you're moving forward. But the other thing it did, it allowed for the headlight to turn into the direction of the turn. Now, years later, some modern cars would do that, but for 1948, this was pretty creative. Now, the interesting thing is that a lot of states actually did not allow for a third headlight up front, so they actually had to create a cover that was going to go over the front of this, and would block it out. I should point out also that this wasn't the first time that something like this had been tried. I think more than 40 years earlier, another car company had come up with the idea of having lights that turned into the direction of where the car was steering to, but it was pretty creative for its day in 1948. I love the design on this Alex Tremulous design, the way it's so aerodynamic. These little cove sections right here allow the air to go up here. I like the way the headlights are set out on these pillars up front, if you almost want to call it that. If you go, years later, the 1955 Mercedes-Benz, or in the early 50s, the SLs, this is the kind of headlight they would move to. The Corvette, of course, would move to that. And the styling down the line on the side is very post-World War II. After World War II, a lot of the styling got into what they called the pontoon fenders. Remember, in pre-war, fenders were really big and bold and stuck out. And they were trying to do something a little bit different. So they're referred to as pontoon fenders. And if you look at the front of this car, you can see the line right here. It's just a design touch, designed to kind of emulate what a fender would have looked like, but it's sleeker and a better design. There's some other safety innovations that were built into this car. For example, it has an integrated roll bar. If the car were to roll over, that top was designed to protect the passengers inside. The doors are also a little different. You'll notice that there's a really big section right here. When you open the door, it's different than if you were opening a traditional car. Most cars would have ended right about here. This goes up to here, and the reason being, it allowed your head to get in just a little bit easier, gave you just a little bit more room as you were getting into the car. In the back, well, they went with suicide doors, as we call them today. Made it a little bit easier for the people to get in and out of the car. Why do they call them suicide doors? Well, as cars got faster and faster, the concern was if the door wasn't quite closed properly, it could open up, and the bigger concern was that the passenger could then fall out. They became very popular, of course, on those 1960 Continentals, and a few companies have done them since then for a variety of reasons, but for the most part, suicide doors just didn't have the popularity as time went along. One of the design touches I love right here is this, we'll call it a trapezoid shape for this window in the back, the way it looks into the seat. Very cool design touch right there. Go to the back of the car. We'll talk about the engine in just a little bit. But it's almost interesting the way that it's a grill in the back. Remember, this was supposed to be an air-cooled engine. Ultimately, however, it became a water-cooled engine. I love the styling touches of the exhaust pipes. Remember, this is a 6-cylinder car, so we've got 3 exhaust pipes on either side, kind of telling us that it's going to have 6 cylinders inside. It's just a nice little touch. I love the fact that they've got this cool crest. All the cool cars had to have something really innovative and design-worthy. It's got these tail fins that sit up above the fender. Now, you have to remember, the post-World War II era was just starting to get into tail fins. The 1948 Cadillac was really the car that did that. Although the pre-war Cadillacs did have small fins that kind of came up. And this was also a touch of that fin beginning to show its way in the post-World War II era cars. So it has the same kind of design touches that you're going to see in a lot of manufacturers, but it also has so many other innovative ideas from a styling perspective that are really pretty cool for this particular car. We'll get into the interior in just a moment, but once again, if you had seen this car driving down the road in 1948, you would be astounded. That third headlight at the front, that cool back with the fastback styling in behind, the fenders with the pontoon look, the taillights that pop up, and that big grille across the back. It just looked completely different than any other car that you were going to see on the road back in the late 40s. And it was designed to be both creative looking and innovative and safe at the same time. If you want to build a car that's truly innovative, well, it has to be more than just the cool design. It's got to be how the car is powered, the engine you put into it. And Preston Tucker decided, well, he didn't just want a boring 6 or 8-cylinder water-cooled engine up front. He wanted an air-cooled engine in the back of the car, similar to the Volkswagen that we're used to, the Beetle that came out in the post-World War II era. He also had a plan to build his own engine. 589 cubic inches. Now you need to understand that is an absolutely huge engine, only 6 cylinders. It was going to be very innovative. It was going to produce 200 horsepower, but idle at just 100 RPM. It was going to be what's called a horizontally opposed engines, meaning that some of the cylinders were going to go this way, some were going to go that way, once again similar to a Volkswagen. Some people call that a boxer engine because the pistons are bouncing back and forth as if they're boxing. The problem was this brand new, creative, innovative engine that he came up with couldn't do the job. First off, it was supposed to produce 200 horsepower. It was only making about 90. And that low RPM, well, that meant that they couldn't get enough oil pressure to get all the oil up to lubricate the cylinders properly. So at a certain point, Tucker and his gang finally decided, that engine is just not going to be able to do what we want it to do. So they looked around. They thought, what other engines are available? And once again, instead of just going to Detroit and saying, what's out there, they looked into the aviation world and they found this engine, 6 cylinders, 166 horsepower. And they thought, this is it, we found it. It was actually being built by a company called Air-Cooled Motors, and it was being used for, I think it was the Bell 47 helicopter. They had contracts, in fact, to build those. Preston Tucker looked at this and said, wait a minute, this is the perfect engine for what we need. It'll fit back here, it's the right size, and it produced enough power. 166 horsepower. It was an air-cooled engine, again, horizontally opposed. Tucker decided to use it here. He decided he couldn't use the air-cooled aspect of it, so he put a radiator in back here. He's got hoses that go in and feed water, liquid to the engine to keep it cooled. And this is perhaps where he made one of his strategic mistakes. He liked this engine so much, he decided he wouldn't just buy the engine from the company, he'd buy the entire company. That way they could focus on just one thing, providing the engines he needed to keep his Tucker Automotive Motor Company going. The problem is at that point that the company had some contracts to supply these for helicopters. He canceled those. We're not going to do any of that stuff. We're going to focus just on getting these engines for our cars. Now you realize as time went along, he was in a big cash flow crunch. He needed money. If he'd kept that contract going, he might have had at least a little bit of money to be able to pay some of the bills as they were coming across. But once again, he didn't want to do that. So he ended up with a 6-cylinder, what was an air-cooled engine converted to traditional liquid-cooled, horizontally opposed. It's a 6-volt. As I mentioned earlier, there was a problem with the transmissions. Once again, they had a plan to build their own transmission, couldn't do that. Then they began to look around and figure out, well, what are the options? And they looked at a transmission that used to be used in the Cord, and they realized, this could actually work for us. The problem is they weren't making it anymore. So they actually had to send people out into the junkyard to try and find some of these transmissions, pull them out of the graveyard, if you want to say that, and fit them in here. It turns out they work just fine, but there weren't enough of them. So as they go through the production of this car, some of the Tuckers have those old graveyard transmissions from the Cord. Some of them have what's called the Y1 transmission, which is ultimately a modified new version of that same transmission. But those who drive these cars say they love them, that they work just fine. With all the compromises that had to be made with this car, it turns out it's not really that bad. It's very innovative, very creative, but of course in many ways probably doomed them because of cost overruns and the way they were trying to create something new that was going to power the Tucker 48. Preston Tucker didn't just want his cars to be innovative, he wanted them to be safe as well. And when you look at the interior of this car, you begin to realize there's a lot of safety things that we take for granted today that they use with this car. Now, as I mentioned, it has an integrated roll bar that goes through the center section of the roof. It also has a perimeter frame. Now that's designed to create what we think of today as a safety cell for the passengers, something that makes it a little more difficult for the car to be crushed so it protects the people inside. But there's some other things that Preston Tucker did as well. The most obvious that you can see right here is this section. Now what we're used to in the late 40s and for quite some time are steel dashboards. Well, the problem with a steel dashboard, in an accident, if you were thrown forward, remember you didn't have seat belts back then, so you were going to be thrown forward and people would hurt themselves quite seriously ramming into the steel dashboard. Well, today we have padded dashboards, right? You think about it, there's no steel up there, it's all some type of padding. That's what Preston Tucker wanted to do. You'll notice this whole section that goes across the front of the car, it's actually padding. If you were to get thrown into that, it wouldn't do, well, let's hope, as much damage as a steel dashboard would do. Another innovation that he used was this windshield. Now, it was made of laminated glass. Henry Ford had pioneered laminated glass years before, but this one very strong. And significantly, if there was a rollover, this windshield was designed to pop out of the car as opposed to coming in. So the lamination would prevent all the shards from coming in and cutting somebody. And the fact that the lamination would probably keep the windshield together, and then the design allowed it to pop out, meant that if the car did roll over, there was a serious accident, people inside would be just a little bit safer as a result of that. Part of the big safety cell that we have in here. Another thing that he did for the drivers was he wanted all of the drivers' controls to be very quickly and easily accessible. You see, everything is within the driver's reach. He doesn't have to go over here to touch the radio or anything else. So it's all easily within the driver's reach. The radio right here off to the side. This is what's called an electric pre-select transmission. So as you're driving down the road, you can control this by putting it into gear, then pushing in the clutch, and then it would choose the gear for you. So an electric pre-select had been used before in the, I believe in the Cord, but this was a great way to make things just a little bit safer and theoretically a little bit smoother as well. One other thing that he did, which is very creative, and this had nothing to do with safety, but it did have to do with securing the car. He made a locking emergency brake. You could pull this out, and then right beside it is a location for a key. So if you had parked the car in a parking lot, you pulled out the emergency brake, and then you could lock the emergency brake in place. And by doing so, it became very difficult to steal the car, right? Now, somebody could still break into that. There was a way to get around it, I'm sure, because thieves are very creative. But at least they could deter the simple people who are simply trying to, well, figure out some quick way to get in and steal the car. So a locking emergency brake, which no one else ever adopted. I'm not quite sure why, but it was a great way to initially secure the car. When you look in the inside of this car, there's another thing that you might not notice right off the bat, but that's the fact that it has so much room in here. That's because there's no engine in the front, there's no transmission tunnel that comes back here. This electric pre-select actually has linkage that's going back through the car, which is what made it a little bit easier to do because the car was in the back. But because of that, you have a lot more room, and this also becomes a kind of safety cell. If there was an accident and somebody was thrown into the front of the car, it's kind of the way school buses were designed, where safety is down here because it allows the passenger to come into this safety zone without hitting their head on a steel dashboard. But it gives them a lot more room. And if you had 3 people in the front of the car, which was very common, if you had 3 people in the front of the car, you also had more leg room. This car was just much more comfortable because of the design they used. Having the engine in the rear, no big transmission tunnel, and then of course the safety aspects as well. All the controls within the driver's reach, that integrated roll bar, the perimeter frame, the safety glass that would pop out, and of course, this padded dashboard. Once again, the Tucker, way ahead of its time. If you don't have a traditional dashboard, where do you put the glove compartment? Well, here's the solution. You move it to the door. This little panel right here, just push this button, and you can reach in and put whatever you need in there. And of course, Tucker wouldn't have one of those tacky door handles. He's got this very elegant push button that allows you to open the door and exit the vehicle. Of course, if the engine's in the back, you have to have the trunk up front, and that's exactly what we have with the Tucker 48. Now, if you compare it to trunks from, well, back in the 40s and 50s, to be honest with you, it's not that big. We would think, of course, that it's fairly large today. There's plenty of room to put stuff in there. But compared to a trunk from the 40s or 50s in the back of the car, just not quite as big. But of course, it is effective, and we got the spare tire up here. And I'll point out the spare tire actually does a couple of things. First off, it's there in case you get a flat. But it also adds weight to the front of the car. Remember, you got the engine in the back, you got the passengers in there. You don't have very much up here, and as a result, you needed to have a little bit more weight. Having this tire adds just a little bit more weight over the front wheels to give it a little more steering stability. While there were plenty of safety innovations that made it into the car, there were others that did not make the cut, either for time or money. For example, he wanted disc brakes on this car. That didn't happen. He wanted magnesium wheels. He wanted self-sealing tubeless tires. He wanted a direct drive torque converter transmission. Lord knows they had enough problems with the transmission. They tried it, couldn't get it to work. They also wanted fuel injection. So there were plenty of things they tried, but they couldn't achieve. By the way, one little design element I love about this is this air inlet on the back of the fender right here. It hides something in plain sight. That is where you get access to the gas cap to fill it up with fuel. Hidden right there behind that very cool looking grill. So what led to the demise of the Tucker? Well, remember at the beginning of this video, I talked about the question as to whether he was an automotive genius, a con man, or just a well-intended enthusiast who got in over his head. The reality is it might be a little bit of all three. You know, when you look back at what happened, there's no question that financial problems were an awful big part of it. You know, his ability to try to raise the money was actually very impressive. I mean, he truly was a salesman. He had more than $15 million that he raised to put this on the streets. But he was trying to do it in such a short time frame and have so many innovations at the same time that it was just reaching for too much too quickly. Then, of course, there were the problems with the Securities and Exchange Commission, not in selling stock, but in trying to sell the features associated with this car that people were going to be buying. He tried to sell those in advance, and the Securities Exchange Commission said, well, basically, you're trying to sell stock in the company, and you can't do that. He was indicted along with some of the other people in the company. There was a big trial. He was found not guilty, but by then, a lot of damage was done, which, of course, led to some very bad publicity. When you're trying to come out with something new and innovative and creative that really is going to have to reach out and interest the entire American public, having a trial like that is not helpful. But to be honest with you, that wasn't the only problem. When they unveiled the car, when they had the debut of it, the car couldn't get into reverse, and it got a lot of bad publicity right there on the spot. There was one article that called it a tin goose. In fact, that became the nickname for the prototype. You know, the spruce goose, that was Howard Hughes' big, huge wooden plane that they said would never fly. Ultimately, it did, and ultimately this car drove. But the tin goose was not a moniker you wanted for your car. And then with that bad publicity, the dealers began to bail. And if you don't have a dealership network, if you don't have the ability to sell the cars, that became another problem. It's interesting because there were just over 30 cars that were built, I think 37 or so, that were built as part of the official production. And even after things began to shut down, some of the loyal workers actually went in and finished up 13 of the cars. So that's why there's a total of 50 production cars that were built. But those last 13 were really done thanks to the goodwill of the people who worked at that factory because they believed in the cars so much. So it's an interesting story about, well, what could go wrong? Now, there is a great movie. It's called Tucker, A Man in His Dream. Francis Ford Coppola made the movie. It kind of pins the demise of Tucker on, you know, the big automakers, the fact they didn't want the competition, something so innovative out on the road. In reality, I have a feeling they probably didn't care that much about Tucker. He was too small to worry about at that moment in time. So it was really more his mistakes that ultimately brought this dream, this automotive dream, to an end. But for what it's worth, it's a really cool car, and it's definitely a very interesting, if not short, chapter in the automotive evolution.